Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, I'm Nicole, and in today's video we're looking at a powerful writing concept that will help you to write a gripping plot while weaving a compelling message into your story. This concept is called the conflict triangle. It will help you if you're having trouble ratcheting up the tension in your story so that your readers care about your protagonist, or if you want to give your protagonist a convincing character arc where their personality transforms over the course of your story. It will also help you if you are a nonfiction writer and maybe you want to include stories in your ads or in a blog post. So what exactly is this concept of the conflict triangle? So this topic was actually suggested to me by an email subscriber who asked if I could explore a character in screenwriting called the stakes character. And as I was researching this topic, I discovered this fascinating concept of the conflict triangle. So thank you so much for suggesting this topic. So basically, you know that you need a protagonist in your story. This is going to be the main character. This is going to be the character that has some kind of goal that they're trying to achieve over the course of the story. For example, let's say that your character wants to win a race. Now, it would be a pretty boring story if they have no obstacles in their path and they are able to just easily win the race. And that's where the antagonist comes in, and the antagonist doesn't necessarily have to be another character. The antagonist could also be an antagonizing force. For example, if there was a storm preventing the protagonist from winning the race, or maybe there's a robot that's preventing them from winning the race, that would be an example of technology. But basically, you need to have these two characters for a story, an antagonist and a protagonist. And when they come into conflict, there are two questions that you need to answer. What does the protagonist lose if the antagonist wins? What does the protagonist gain if the protagonist wins? And so the answer to these questions shows what's at stake for the protagonist and help the readers to understand what is motivating the protagonist and why it is so important for them to defeat the antagonist. So for example, if there was a storm, but we find out that the protagonist doesn't have to run the race that day, maybe there's another race that he could run on a different day, we would say, okay, why does he have to go out in this storm to try and win this race? Like, there's no reason for that. So you want to answer these questions and show what is really at stake for the protagonist. And that is where the stakes character enters the scene, and they become the embodiment of the answer to this question of what's at stake for the protagonist. And you can look at this as a triangle. So we have the protagonist on one side, we have the antagonist on the other side, and in the middle we have the stakes character. Maybe this looks familiar to you because you will have seen this in the concept of the love triangle in literature and in movies. So when you have this classic love triangle, you will have the protagonist on one side, and they are in love, let's say, with a woman who is in the middle. She is the stakes character in the story. And then, of course, we have the villain, the antagonist on the other side, who is also in love with this woman or is threatening her life in some way or something like that. And so we know that if the protagonist does not defeat the villain, he's going to lose this woman's love or something like that. So of course, this love triangle is a really popular writing technique in the love story genre, but you will also see it in other genres as well. And so for example, you will see the conflict triangle in murder mysteries, for example, where you might have, in a murder mystery, you'll have a detective who's the protagonist, and then let's say the murderer is the antagonist. And so a lot of murder mysteries will just have that plot line. But you could also have where the murderer, they killed somebody at the beginning of the story, but they're going to strike again to kind of cover up their tracks or something like that, or maybe they're just a serial killer. And in that instance, you're going to have a stakes character, and now we have a reason why the detective wants to stop the murderer. So they need to catch the murderer so they don't kill the stakes character. And you'll also see this concept of the conflict triangle in other genres like the thriller genre, the adventure genre, where if you think of a movie like Alfred Hitchcock's The Man Who Knew Too Much, or the movie Man on Fire with Denzel Washington, where you have a character who is kidnapped and then the protagonist has to track down the kidnappers. So again, you have that conflict triangle, protagonist on one side, the kidnappers, the antagonists on another side, and then in the middle you have the stakes character, who is the person who is kidnapped. And so, of course, this goes back to the classic trope in literature of the damsel in distress, where, you know, it's just a way to really get you emotionally invested in the story. If you think of superhero films, appears a lot of times in Marvel movies as well, where there's a stakes character like Iron Man trying to save Pepper Potts or something like that. It gets you really invested in the story, where you understand why it's so important for the protagonist to win, because they need to save the stakes character. Now, the stakes character doesn't necessarily appear in every single story. It's just one way to add tension to a story. And it's also a really great way to weave a theme into your story, a message that your readers can take away from your story. And we'll look at that next. How you could take this concept of the stakes character and elevate it from just being, you know, this person in distress, this damsel in distress, but actually make this character a really important part of your story to give your story a layer of complexity. So I made a video called The Ladder of Abstraction, and in that video I talked about the importance of having some kind of message or theme in your writing, a universal theme that readers would be able to relate to, so that your story isn't just a story about your characters, but those characters are learning some kind of a lesson that your readers are able to take away from your story. And that's what makes a piece of literature endure and makes it unforgettable, is when it has some kind of a theme that readers can take away. So for example, if you think of a book like Pride and Prejudice, this book was obviously written a really long time ago, but it has this universal message of how pride can stop you from developing lasting relationships. And so obviously it's no longer constrained to that time period. That's a theme that anybody can take away from that book. It applies to people during any time. And that's what makes it so memorable and unforgettable. And so if you want to weave a theme into your story, then the conflict triangle is a really fantastic way to do that. And a lot of times when we begin writing a story, we might not know, what that message is going to be, but we discover it as we're writing the plot, as we're plotting, as we're developing our characters, or even as we start reaching the climax of our story. And the conflict triangle is a really great way, once you discover what that theme is and you really want to drive it home for your readers, using the conflict triangle is a really great way to weave that theme effectively into your story. So a really effective way to weave a theme into your story is to have a character arc where your protagonist starts out at the beginning of the story. Their philosophy or worldview is not in alignment with your central theme, but over the course of the story, their personality changes so that by the end of the story, they are a different character. And you can see this in a book like A Christmas Carol, where you have Scrooge, who at the beginning, he's this miserly old man and he's very, very selfish. And then we have the stakes character, Tiny Tim, who, has a completely different personality. He's very, very selfless. And obviously his life is at stake in the story. If Scrooge doesn't change, then Tiny Tim is going to die. And so over the course of the story, Scrooge has this transformation of character, becomes a completely different person, a selfless person, and he saves Tiny Tim at the end of the story. So that's a basic concept. It's still a little bit abstract. So let's look at exactly how you can do this with the conflict triangle. Let's see it in action with an example from film, and let's look at the movie It's a Wonderful Life. We know what the central idea of the story is because the character Clarence tells us at the end of the movie, he says, "No man is a failure who has friends." So now if we go back to the conflict triangle and we put our characters on that conflict triangle, we will see at the beginning of the story who is in alignment with that philosophy and who isn't. George Bailey is the protagonist. At the beginning of the movie, his worldview is not in alignment with that main message. He doesn't want to be stuck in this little town of Bedford Falls. He doesn't want to run the family business, the Bailey Building and Loan. He wants to go to college. He wants to see the world, and he says he wants to build things. He wants to build skyscrapers and bridges and leave his mark on the world. We have the antagonist, Henry Potter, who he just wants to buy up as much as he can of Bedford Falls, and he wants to make as much money as he can. He really doesn't care about anyone. And then we have the stakes character in the middle, who is Mary Bailey, who, George Bailey ends up getting stuck in Bedford Falls. He never accomplishes his dreams. He ends up running the Bailey Building and Loan. And Mary is actually very content. She loves her family and she loves building homes for people who are poor and helping them to have homes to live in. And so, of course, the climax of the story is when George Bailey gets to have this experience of what Bedford Falls would be like if he was never born and if he had never stayed there and had not continued to run the Bailey Building and Loan. And the very last character that he meets is Mary Bailey, and he sees, everything basically that he would lose. And so then, of course, he understands that this message of the story, like he isn't a failure in his life, even though he never got to accomplish these great aspirations that he had. But he had friends, and he did make this town so much better for the people who lived in it. And so that's a really powerful way to use the conflict triangle, where your protagonist and your antagonist and your stakes character are all embodying these different messages in the story. And basically we know which is the correct message by which one ends up winning. We can see the consequences of the actions the protagonist takes. And if there are bad consequences, we know, so the author must be saying that that's not the path to take. If there are good consequences, then we know that that is the path that the protagonist should take. And there's another really great way that you can continue to weave a theme, and that's by actually having, we saw that in It's a Wonderful Life, where one of the characters voices the theme of the story. But you can also have your protagonist, really show his character arc by even having him, come to that conclusion at the end of the story that the message, the theme of your story is true. And we see that in the film Casablanca. So if you look at the conflict triangle of the movie Casablanca, you have Rick, who is the protagonist. The movie takes place during World War II in Morocco. Rick is running a nightclub there. And at the beginning of the movie, he's very, very cynical. We're not really sure if he thinks that the Allies are going to win. He's kind of cynical about the war effort. There are refugees who are passing through his nightclub trying to get to the United States. So he does help them, but very reluctantly. Then we have, of course, the antagonist of the movie, who would be the Germans, and one German officer in particular. And obviously their philosophy, their worldview is going to be, completely believing that the Allies are going to fail, and they're doing all in their power to stop the Allies from winning the war. And then we have the stakes character in the middle, who is this character Ilsa Lund. And we find out that she was actually in love with Rick in France, and she would have been married to a resistance fighter, Victor Laszlo, but she thought that he had died. She had fallen in love with Rick, and she found out that Victor Laszlo wasn't dead. So she decided to leave Rick and go back with her husband to continue fighting against the Germans. And at this point in the story, when the story opens, she returns because she needs Rick's help to get her husband out of Morocco. And so over the course of the story, we are going to see Rick's transformation, where he starts out as this character who says, I don't stick my neck out for nobody, to becoming more selfless, where he's willing to sacrifice the person that he loves, Ilsa, in order for the war effort so that Victor Laszlo can continue fighting. And it's really interesting because at the beginning of the story, Ilsa was actually willing to make the sacrifice herself. She leaves Rick and goes back to her husband. But as she's trying to get Rick to help her, this time when she's in Morocco, she starts to kind of doubt whether she should stay with Victor Laszlo or not, and she almost makes the decision to stay with Rick. And so at the climax of the story, Rick actually has to convince her to get on the plane and go with Victor Laszlo, and convince her that her worldview at the beginning of the story was actually correct. And so he says the famous line, I'm no good at being noble, but it doesn't take much to see that the problems of three little people don't amount to a hill of beans in this crazy world. And so obviously with that line, he is summing up the theme of the movie, which is about how, you know, these like individual concerns of people when you're fighting this, you know, big worldwide war, like sometimes you have to make these sacrifices and be selfless. And I think this is a really, really great way that you can really, you know, drive home the theme of your story by actually having your stakes character, who is usually like a foil for the protagonist, where they're representing that worldview that the protagonist needs to reach at the end of the story. But you can kind of have them start to doubt that worldview, and then as your protagonist changes, as your protagonist personality transforms, and they get closer to believing in the message of your story, they actually have to convince the stakes character of that and kind of make the stakes character, you know, not doubt the message of the story anymore. So I think that's a really interesting way that you can really drive home that theme in your story. So just some closing thoughts, because I think I only really scratched the surface of the conflict triangle in this movie, and I think that you can really use it in all different kinds of ways. And one way that I was thinking was that your stakes character might actually end up, you know, if you really develop that character, could actually end up becoming a dual protagonist. So you'll see that in a movie like E.T., where that movie actually has two protagonists, Elliot and E.T., and of course at the climax of the movie both of their lives are at stake. And also I was thinking, you know, if you're writing a tragedy, then you might have where your protagonist ends up completely rejecting the stakes character and their message, you know, they are embodying this message of your story, but your protagonist might end up rejecting that and going in a completely different direction to their ultimate downfall or something like that. So those are just some things to keep in mind, and I'd love to hear in the comments if you have any thoughts about the conflict triangle, if you have other examples from films or from literature where you've seen this concept, and if you're going to use it in your own writing. So if you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe to me here on YouTube for more videos like this one, and I'll also put a link in the description to my email newsletter where you can sign up and get more writing resources. Thank you so much for watching. Have a fantastic week. God bless, and I wish you all the best with your writing projects.